Before we start the show, please don't forget to subscribe to ClimateTech with Kentaro on your favorite podcast app if you haven't already. While you're there, you can also rate and leave us a review. Help us reach more listeners and build a community of climate tech enthusiasts and problem solvers. Thanks for your support, and now on to today's episode. The definition that most people think about maniac is a person exhibiting, extreme symptoms of wild behavior and violence and danger, but there's actually another definition of it, which is simply an obsessive enthusiast. And
it worries me a little bit that you've memorized the definition of maniac.
This is Climate Tech with Kentaro, a podcast featuring the brightest minds and most influential voices in climate tech. I'm your host, Kentaro Kawamori. Today's guest is Josh Green, Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of the leading ESG data management platform for private capital markets, Novata. Josh and I had the chance to meet on multiple occasions before he went on to building Novata. So much has happened in Josh's career, and I'm just privileged to now be a part of it through Persefoni. Earlier this month, our companies formed a strategic partnership, which we'll dive into later in the show. In this episode, we chat about why Novata decided to focus on private markets and the problems the company is solving for. We also have a conversation about purpose and why we keep doing the things we do. As a two-time founder, Josh and I also talk about a proverbial statement that he once said, which I know resonates with a lot of serial entrepreneurs. And that is, I will never do this again.
I said to you, Kentaro, I want you to know before we start talking that I might start a business that's competitive to yours. So just keep that in mind. And you said, welcome to the space. I'm happy to share. The more people we have working on these problems, the better. And I think that's a credit to you, but also I think is reflective of the space. I think there's a sense that the problems that we're trying to solve are so big. The amount of talent that we need to solve these problems equally big. And so, let's get a lot of people in here. And that's a nice, I think, tone for us as a community to have when we're trying to tackle these problems that are bigger than any one business. So, maybe that's not so embarrassing for you, Kentaro, but I figured it was worth sharing because I actually genuinely appreciated that conversation. Novata, I can give you the headline about the company, and then we can talk more about where it came from, where it's going. But big picture, we are the leading environmental, social, and governance, also known as ESG. We're the leading ESG solution for private markets. And what that means is that Novata helps companies and their investors do a few things: measure, analyze, report non-financial metrics that matter. And if you take a step back and look at ESG as something that has become very much part of doing business, I think it's fair to say that hit the public markets first. It hit public companies who were being scored, rated, discussed through an ESG lens, but that hasn't really happened yet in the private markets. But we see it coming for the private markets, and Novata's designed to jump in and help.
Well, first of all, thanks for recounting that story. And I agree, it's one of the best parts of doing what we do. I actually had this conversation with John Schieber, who was formerly at TechCrunch. Now he's at Footprint Coalition Ventures. I don't know if you know him. He was on the podcast recently. And we talked about that unique dimension in our community. And I actually told him I was a bit worried, and I felt that somewhat inevitably, as so much capital is coming into this space, that I really hope, that the core of us that are early to this can keep that spark alive, because I do think we're going to see a bunch of different behaviors as, more financially oriented and minded folks come in and start building stuff in the space that maybe they're not as mission oriented, and, their capital and greed do weird things to people. But I think we're always going to have a strong community. It's just going to be interesting to see how that evolves with the introduction of so much professional capital into the space.
I hear you. Although what I would say is I think if we just rely on people who are mission driven to create change, I think we're not going to see the scale of change that we need. I want people, I want companies, I want funds getting involved for financial gain. I think that's a sign that the incentives are being aligned nicely. So, I think Novata, and I think it's fair to say Persefoni as well. I think, the mission is very much at the heart of what we do, but we welcome all kinds of players who are. That means more people rowing in the same direction.
I believe strongly in the market force theory that Josh was talking about. By the way, I've been roasted by some when I went on the record to say that I think capitalism created the climate crisis and that I also believe capitalism will solve it. Private capital markets, ESG solution, right? I can say from experience, having done this for a few years now, especially in the private equity space, huge demand, but also across asset owners from pension funds and sovereign wealth funds and all those. How do you think about the world in terms of private capital markets? What spaces within those segments do you play today? And sort of what's your target customer base? And does that evolve? Are you going to be very focused on that? Great to get your perspective on that.
Sure. So the punchline is we're very focused on the private equity space, and we see just tremendous pressure building up on private equity funds to focus on ESG and track these metrics that matter. And the private equity firms, of course, have the ability to influence what their portfolio companies do. So it's the right starting point for us. So that's the punchline. I think stepping back a bit, if you think about the evolution of ESG, I think, as I mentioned, it did hit the public markets first. And, I think it's good and important that ESG is something that's taken seriously by public companies, right? We want public companies being thoughtful about their environmental impact, their social impact, the way in which they're governed. That's great. But it's only part of the story, right? I mean, public companies, obviously, they're some of the biggest, most important companies in the world, but collectively, they're still a minority of economic activity. The majority of economic activity around the world is done by private companies. And so, if you believe, as I do, that ESG can be a positive force, helping to orient capitalism in a direction that is good, not just for businesses, but for society as a whole. If you believe that, then you can't just be satisfied with ESG only being something that public companies are taking seriously. So to be even more tangible about it, right? If only public companies start reducing their carbon emissions, I mean, that's going to be a good thing that they're reducing their carbon emissions. But if no private companies actually take action, we've still got a major problem on our hands, right? So we believe that ESG, in order for it to have an impact, it needs to be something that is impacting the private markets and private companies that represent the majority of economic activity.
Here, Josh talks about how ESG is increasing in importance in the private sector from a few different directions.
So first is regulatory. I think Europe has been on the leading edge of this, and regulation is touching private companies either directly or indirectly. So regulatory pressure is real. And then investor pressure. So, private companies get money from private equity funds. Those private equity funds get money from limited partners, pension funds, endowments. And, those limited partners, those investors in the private equity funds, they're investing in public companies as well, and managers that invest in public companies. And they become accustomed to getting ESG information from those public companies or the managers that are investing in public companies. And they're asking, well, why aren't we getting that same information from the private equity funds that we're investing in about the private companies that they're investing in? I think that's a very reasonable perspective, but you put these things together and what it's turning into is a lot of pressure on private equity funds to do something. Getting started, I think, is the most important step. And frankly, it's a step that I think only a minority of private equity players have taken so far. I think it's been one of the really interesting learnings in the short time we've been up and running is that the market is still very, very early. I think there is clear acceptance that ESG is something that needs to be taken seriously, but in terms of actually taking action, it's a relatively small number of players who've been doing this for a while. And now I think it's coming for the broader market.
Totally.
And one thing I would add to that is I think, sometimes private equity gets, a bad rap in the sense of being perceived as opaque. And, I think in some respects, that's just the nature of a private company, right? Private companies definitionally are not public and therefore responsible for reporting to the public. But there is a flip side to private equity that I think is very important when you think about ESG, which is the private equity business model is about changing businesses very quickly. So if you want to make positive change, whether it's on the environment or social justice, if you can get private equity firms orienting in the direction of change, positive change, they're a really powerful lever for change because they're skilled at changing companies very, very quickly. So that's something it was brought to my attention as I first started learning about the private equity space. And to me, it's one of the most exciting things about the fact that ESG is now so top of mind for private equity, because I think it is going to be a powerful lever.
I agree. And that's what I really enjoy about working within the private equity sector is that level of control and focus on, sustainable returns coming back is big, right? You're right. I think there's a perception out there that's probably anchored in some of the historical, sort of beginning roots of private equity, where it was hostile takeovers and those sorts of things. But, I think certainly the industry has made a long ways in changing that perception. It's not gone, but it's certainly improved wholesale. So tell us a bit more about the tech specifically. So you're working with these private equity firms, helping them solve their ESG reporting needs. How does it work?
Yeah. So ESG is coming for the private markets. And I think that just as true as that fact is, I think equally true is the fact that private markets need help to tackle the ESG challenge. If you look at the private equity players that have been thinking about ESG for a while, they know how hard it is. But folks who are just getting started with ESG, may not have dealt with the pain of doing this for the last few years, but they probably heard about it. They've heard how hard this is. And I think the problems that people have in tackling the ESG challenge, they're going to evolve over time. But we've heard three very consistently that people are facing right now. One is choosing which metrics to track. There's an alphabet soup of standards and frameworks that are out there. And I think you can be forgiven for being a bit bewildered when you look out across that landscape and simply figuring out, okay, yes, I get it. I need to tackle ESG, but which metrics should I track? That's a hard and important question to answer. Problem one, figuring out what to track. Problem two, actually collecting the data. And this is one that may not be obvious at first glance, but anybody who's actually tried this runs into this problem very quickly, right? This data is not just sitting there. Definitionally, right? We're talking about non-financial data. This is new data that many organizations are not tracking currently or are just beginning to track. It's not sitting on a shelf. So let's say you're a private equity firm and you say, okay, here are a handful of metrics that I know I want to track to start understanding the ESG characteristics of my portfolio. And then you go to your portfolio companies and say, all right, now I need this data. You might get blank stares. You may get frustration from portfolio companies saying, oh, one more thing I have to do. You're almost certainly going to get lots of questions from the portfolio companies saying, well, what exactly does this metric mean? And how am I supposed to calculate it? And that kind of collection of problems around data collection, it's a real headache. And then third, and this is kind of a high-class problem, but getting insight from the data. And this is where, folks who have gone through the pain of figuring out what they want to track, collecting the data, then they say, okay, now I've got data. And then you have frankly, a more traditional problem, which is, okay, what's the data telling me and what should I do with it? What are the bright spots? What are the areas of risk? But those three problems are the problems that we see our customers consistently wrestling with. So Novata is set up not just as a technology platform, but as an overall solution to these problems.
Really well articulated. And yeah, I like how you broke that problem set down into three phases, right? It was number one, figuring out what to track. Number two, collecting the data. And number three, distilling insights out of those. Frequently use a version of that, but I like you put that very simply and cohesively together there. Prior to Novata, Josh was the co-founder and CEO of Panjiva, a supply chain data startup that he eventually sold to S&P Global. Along the way, they were recognized on the Inc. 500. Are you technically a serial entrepreneur now? Do you have to do 3? Does 2 qualify?
Yeah, the question of what constitutes a serial entrepreneur, I think is an interesting one. I think,
I think it's a preference for Captain Crunch is what it comes down to.
So, what I will tell you is when I sold the last company, I said to my wife, Lindsay, I said, I'm never, ever doing this again.
I do remember that part of our conversation when we first chatted.
Yeah,
you told me that then.
Then when I chose to do it again, I realized, okay, there's something pretty deep here that is leading me to do this crazy thing more than once. Because it is crazy. I mean, all the data says that most startups fail. And that's overstating the risk for entrepreneurs a bit, right? Because even if the company fails, you still learn a lot from it, have a good experience. But nevertheless, it is a brutally tough journey. And, I went through it once, and my takeaway from that, it came when we were selling the business, because that process itself was so hard. I was like, this is supposed to be the good part. If this is so hard, forget it. I'm out. But, a couple years later, maybe memory fades, but more importantly, I realized it's the thing that I love and it's the thing that I'm good at, building businesses. It's so much fun. It is so rewarding. And that's something that I can't escape. Or maybe I can one day, but I certainly have not escaped it yet.
Before Josh dives deep into his first outing as a founder, it's worth noting that Josh started his career in consulting. He worked as a consultant for the Boston Consulting Group, also known as BCG.
Eventually found my way back to grad school and wanted to, while I was in school, find people to build a business with, and then when I graduated, launch a business. And that's actually kind of what happened. I met a phenomenal business partner, Jim Pasota, and he and I got really excited about an opportunity in the world of international trade. And we launched Panjiva when I finished school. And the idea was to bring transparency to the world of international trade, which frankly, until pretty recently, most people kind of thought, well, that's kind of niche. And, now everybody's like, oh, supply chain. Supply chains are really important and traditionally very, very opaque. And we sought to change that and built the business over more than a decade. And we were acquired in 2018 by S&P Global. And that, of course, was, a big moment for us personally, and it was a big moment for us as a company. And, my personal view is that when you're an entrepreneur and you're acquired, the acquirer is essentially the last shareholder you'll ever have. And it's your responsibility to do right by that shareholder in the same way that you've done right by all your previous shareholders. And it's one of the things that I'm most proud of, that S&P Global's had such a fantastic experience integrating Panjiva and bringing Panjiva to its customers. But I became a dad, and I eventually reached the conclusion that I wanted my next startup to be for my kids and for the world that they're going to inhabit. And, this is all in the context of COVID and, all the trauma that's created. I think it's been a real turning point for climate. And so as I started thinking about what I wanted to do next, starting something actually wasn't highest on the list. It was doing something that I felt would be positive in terms of the impact that it would have on the world. And that, selfishly was for my kids, more unselfishly, I think, for the next generation.
In July 2021, Novata closed its $21 million Series A funding round. Principal investors for the round included the Ford Foundation, Omidyar Network, S&P Global, and Hamilton Lane. The investment was one of the largest initial funding rounds for a public benefit corporation.
Just a lot happening, and I think a lot happening in the sense that there's, this is a market where people need help. There's significant demand. And then also a lot happening internally in terms of us organizationally learning and evolving. And I think that's critically important, I think, just as a general thing for sure, but also in a market that's as early and as dynamic as this market, because the needs of customers are going to evolve over time. We have to build an organization that has a mix of talents and a natural flexibility that will allow it to evolve over time as our clients' needs evolve. So, as you can tell, I'm having fun, and I have to say, it's a lot more fun the second time around.
I'm glad to hear that. More fun is always better.
And maybe to argue against myself for a second, maybe it's not that it's more fun. Maybe it was just as fun the first time around, but fear as a proportion of the overall experience is just much lower the second time around.
Yeah, that's right.
Kentaro, I think you're a pretty balanced guy, but I think back to my first entrepreneurial experience and I was terrified a lot of the time. It just felt like the stakes were so high for me personally. Once you take on professional investors, your responsibilities to them. Once you have a team, your responsibilities to them. It was scary. And, I think that was one of the hardest things about that particular journey. Now, as we're building the company, I've seen these things before. It's not that, any of the responsibilities are any less, but it's like turning down the volume a bit, I suppose, on the fear. And I think that allows it to be a little bit more fun.
So much of what you just said, resonates deeply. And it's always fun to have founder conversations because there's just so much of that kinship that it's so difficult to describe to people unless you've gone through this. But, I think I've boiled it down to a few things. And you mentioned a few times, right? The fun you have and this call you had, this instinctive drive to it. And I tell people all the time to do this successfully. And if you look back at the vast majority of successful founders, they are maniacs. And I don't mean maniac in the negative connotation, right? The definition that most people think about maniac is a person exhibiting, extreme symptoms of wild behavior and violence and danger. But there's actually another definition of it, which is simply an obsessive enthusiast. And at the core, that's what we do, right? You just become obsessed with this thing because it's how we're wired. It's what you do when you're awake. It's what you do when you're sleeping. You can't shut your brain off. We need that stimulation, whether it's intellectual, energy, the team. So, I've found that to be my simplest way to explaining it to people is, the successful founders broadly are maniacs in a good way.
It worries me a little bit that you've memorized the definition of maniac, but
well, it comes with the territory when you have to redefine it for people.
Right. No, I take your point. I mean, I said it earlier that I think, you have to be a little crazy to go down this path. But, the entrepreneurial path, I think what we ask of founders, I think it's really an incredible thing that founders are asked to do. And, the way that I describe it is that, you're often told as a founder, you have to be resilient. You have to go through the no's and, you're going to get no's and keep going. One of the investors in Panjiva described entrepreneurship as being a zombie in a zombie movie, right? You just keep going and they keep like putting stakes in your body and you just keep going and you just keep going, right? And I think, that's one thing that we ask of founders. We're like, you just got to keep going. People are going to tell you no, keep going, right? So there's this stubbornness that's asked of founders. But then there's this other thing, which is, okay, you got to be flexible. No business plan ever works as you expect. You've got to, listen to your customers and you got to flex. So which is it? Are you supposed to be really stubborn or are you supposed to be really flexible? And, the answer, of course, is both. And you've got to know the right time. But it's not easy to do both those things. And it's not just a personal challenge, right? It's an organizational challenge. You have to figure out organizationally, how do you, have the clarity of vision to orient people in a way that they know what they're doing and can make decisions on a day-to-day basis that aligns with that vision. And there has to be a consistency over time in order to make progress. But at the same time, you've also got to build in the flexibility organizationally to be able to adapt because, the truth is, most things don't work. And every now and again, you find something that does work. And when you do, you got to grab onto it. You got to run with it. And I think that requires a level of flexibility. But to be able to, I think there's this notion of holding two opposing ideas in your mind at the same time. I think it's one of the things that entrepreneurial organizations collectively need to do.
Totally. Yeah, it's, you have to be a creator first and foremost, and that requires creativity and process and system and flexibility, adaptability, all those at the same time. It's a beautiful thing. It's the most rewarding and the most frustrating thing in the world, to your point, at exactly the same time. And yeah, always right. What somebody said early on, right? I think it's become a more common phrase in our world is the highs are incredibly high and the lows are incredibly low. But I think what they forgot to add is that could happen within minutes of each other every day for a long time to come. And I remember you saying something about that in our first conversation as well. And man, that holds true every day.
Every day, something good happens. Every day, something bad happens. Every day I do something right. Every day I do something wrong. And that's just a lot. That's just a lot to have happening every day. But it's worth it. It's worth it, I think, to get to create something that the world has never seen, to get to work with extraordinarily talented people. It's one of the things that's been just absolutely magical about the Novata experience is the set of people that have come together, from the investors to the advisors to the management team. It's extraordinary.
Any closing thoughts, messages for the ClimateTech community at large that you'd like to leave us with?
I'd say a couple things. I think one is be optimistic. I think I love your framing of working on climate as being a privilege, but let's not lose sight of the fact that it's also touching on some issues that are very frightening. And I think it's easy to get down. It's easy to feel climate anxiety, right, as it's now being branded. I think it's easy to let those things overwhelm you, and I think it's particularly challenging for people who are in it, working on it every day, right? Because you don't have a choice. You're thinking about this stuff every day. But I think there's a lot of good reasons to be optimistic. And I think it's really important to presume that we can make progress on these challenging issues. Because, if we don't, then the answer is very, very clear, right? So, certainly lots of people are out there saying this, but I think it needs to be said again and again. I think we can build a future that's going to be awesome. And I think a clean energy future is going to be ours, and it's going to be awesome. So that's one thing. Second, I would say, a real learning for me, I think, is the intersection of climate and social justice. ESG is kind of a weird acronym, candidly, right? Environmental, social, governance. Like it can feel like apples and oranges and bananas all in the same acronym. But these things are very related, right? When you think about climate and the impact that it's going to have, it's, if nothing changes, there's going to be a big impact, and it's going to fall disproportionately on people who have historically been disadvantaged. And, that's a moral issue, right? That we have to take seriously. And so I personally am heartened by what I'm seeing as folks are thinking about how to make progress on ESG issues, that people aren't viewing it as, I just want to do X. I just want to focus on this one specific aspect. I think there's a reason why we look at a whole bunch of things simultaneously, because these things are interrelated. Governance relates to how you manage risk. How you manage risk relates to climate. Climate is going to have an impact on social structures, and there will be social justice implications. So these things are connected. And I think there is a real tension, and it's one of the reasons why I'm excited about working with Persefoni. I think there is a real tension in the market, because I think there is a complexity to carbon accounting that is real and intense. And so there's this desire for solutions that are tailor-made to solve problems in and around that space. But at the same time, people recognize actually there is a large and growing body of things that we need to care about beyond making money for our shareholders. We've got to think about how we treat our employees. We've got to think about how our business impacts society and the communities in which we operate. And, I think there's a desire to have solutions that cover the breadth of these topics.
Josh, thanks a bunch for coming on. Really appreciate your insights, and you've been so generous with your time and knowledge, and so excited to see what Novata will do in the future. So excited to see your maniac execution of this next startup, and super grateful to have you on, and thanks again.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for the work that you're doing at Persefoni, and thanks for hosting a podcast where you have these conversations. It's great to be a part of it. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Josh as much as I did. If you want to learn more about Josh's work at Novata, visit novata.com. Persefoni and Novata also published a white paper entitled Making Sense of Climate Disclosure. I hope you check it out. We'll put the links in our show notes, of course. Before we go, please don't forget to subscribe to ClimateTech with Kentaro on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you listen on. In case you haven't heard, we also launched ClimateTech Deal Digests, where I highlight M&A and funding news in the climate tech space. We drop new episodes every Tuesday. Thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you on our next episode. ClimateTech with Kentaro is produced by our incredible team at Persefoni and Hueman Group Media. Our theme music is by Guesthouse. And if you want to learn more about Persefoni and our climate management and accounting platform, please visit our website at persefoni.com.